Vanguard Apex left Nathan Vance waiting in the sub-freezing lobby for 40 minutes, completely unaware they had just sealed their own termination. Victoria Sterling walked past his faded denim jacket without making eye contact, her heels clicking against the million-dollar granite floor. Beside Nathan, 6-year-old Toby clutched a wooden truck with a missing wheel, his small fingers shivering. Julian Thorne threw a $20 bill at Nathan's muddy work boots, muttering that the corporate office did not tolerate loiterers. Nathan quietly placed the bill into his pocket, his face entirely unreadable. Exactly 6 minutes later, every executive's phone rang with an emergency alert from the parent fund. Apex Trust had finalized the 51% acquisition of the company, and the new owner was already in the building. Victoria panicked, demanding security locate the mystery billionaire who now controlled their careers. The corporate attorney ran into the atrium, bypassed Victoria, and bowed 90 degrees before the man in the denim jacket. Nathan stood up, handed the tablet back to the lawyer, and signed the systemic restructuring order. With one stroke of a pen, he stripped the entire executive board of their options and terminated their contracts for gross ethical violations. Victoria dropped to her knees as security stepped forward to escort the board out of the tower. Toby looked up at the empty boardroom, his voice cutting through the frozen silence of the lobby. He asked if broken people were harder to repair than broken toys. Nathan lifted his son, turned his back on the ruined empire, and walked out into the cold afternoon air. Before we go on, do you think people can truly change after they discover who someone really is? And tell me where you're watching from. The black town car carrying Victoria Sterling and Julian Thorne pulled away from the curb of Vanguard Apex, its tires spitting a fine layer of gray slush against the concrete base of the building. Inside the vehicle, the climate control immediately masked the harshness of the Ohio autumn, replacing it with the synthetic scent of expensive leather and heated seats. Victoria did not look back at the glass entrance where the man in the denim jacket sat with his child. She adjusted the cuffs of her silk blouse, her mind already shifting toward the third quarter restructuring charts waiting on her tablet. The pressure from the primary institutional creditors had been mounting for 6 months, and this lunch meeting with the bridge loan representatives was her final opportunity to secure the capital needed to protect her grandfather's legacy. Julian settled back into the passenger seat, his fingers tapping a rapid rhythm against his leather briefcase. The board expects a signed commitment by 2 o'clock, Julian noted, staring straight through the tinted windshield at the heavy downtown traffic. If the acquisition clauses from the primary trust aren't clearing by then, we lose the operational shield. Victoria did not answer right away. She opened the digital file containing the employee termination logs, her eyes tracking the cost-cutting metrics that had defined her first 14 months as chief executive. Efficiency required cold precision, and she had trained herself to ignore the personal narratives that middle management constantly used to defend their budget overhead. The car moved slowly through the narrow financial district gridlock, the city engine noise muffled to a distant hum. Back on the stone bench inside the atrium, Nathan Vance waited until the exhaust fumes from the departing sedan cleared the outdoor entryway before he shifted Toby to his opposite side. The child's breathing had grown heavier, his small cheek resting against the canvas patch on Nathan's shoulder while his fingers loosely held the broken wooden truck. The single remaining wheel on the toy axle spun twice before coming to a complete rest. Nathan reached into his denim jacket, pulled out the manila envelope containing the secure banking credentials, and checked the encrypted validation code displaying on his mobile device. The corporate verification window was scheduled to close in exactly 45 minutes. He had spent 3 years operating through the quiet anonymity of secondary legal entities, intentionally shielding Toby from the aggressive scrutiny that followed the settlement of his late wife's compliance trust. This physical inspection of Vanguard's leadership was the final condition his attorneys had advised before releasing $40 million in emergency liquidity. He needed to witness how the executives treated the invisible components of their organization, when they believed no one of consequence was watching. A building technician walked past the bench, his heavy utility belt jingling as he checked the atrium thermostat controls. The worker paused, looked at Toby's pale face, and adjusted the air vent registers to redirect the freezing outdoor draft away from the corner seating area. Nathan gave a single slow nod of appreciation. The small gesture of human consideration stood in sharp contrast to the systematic indifference that had just walked out the door. He checked the time once more as the red indicator light above the executive elevator bay began to flash frantically. The flashing crimson indicator above the executive elevator bay reflected off the polished granite floor, casting a sharp, rhythmic glow across the atrium of Vanguard Apex. At exactly 12 minutes past 1, the heavy mahogany doors of the primary conference room on the top floor swung open, and the muffled sound of urgent, overlapping voices spilled out into the secure corridor. Julian Thorne stepped into the hallway first, his silk tie loosened by a fraction of an inch and his fingers tightly gripping a stack of unsigned operational riders. Victoria Sterling followed immediately behind him, her face pale under the direct fluorescent lighting as her assistant handed her a rapidly updating spreadsheet from the corporate treasury terminal. The bridge loan representatives had walked out of the lunch venue 15 minutes prior, leaving a trail of unexecuted term sheets and an ultimatum that expired at the top of the hour. Without the immediate cash infusion from an outside buyer, the company's secondary clearings would fail before the closing bell on Wall Street. Julian turned to Victoria, his thumb frantically scrolling through an automated notification thread from the general counsel's office. The escrow validation flag just went gray on the system, Julian said, his breathing noticeably short as he hurried toward the main control desk. Someone blocked the primary asset transfer from the Nevada family office. Victoria stopped near the glass balcony overview, her eyes narrowing as she studied the flashing server diagnostic warnings on her personal screen. She did not look at the middle managers, who were already gathering near the glass partitions to watch the unfolding crisis. Her grandfather's entire logistics network was anchored to these clearings, and the sudden freeze suggested a deliberate intervention from a secured creditor she had never previously encountered in the compliance database. She picked up her desk phone and signaled the security desk on the ground floor. "Mason, I need the internal identification log for every individual who cleared the secondary perimeter this morning," Victoria commanded, her fingers resting flat against the mahogany railing. "Find out who holds the sub-fiduciary key for the Vanguard debt." Down in the atrium, Nathan Vance remained motionless on the wooden bench, his large hand gently supporting Toby's neck as the child drifted into a shallow sleep. The loose wooden wheel from the toy truck had finally slipped entirely off its axle, rolling across the stone floor until it clicked against the baseboard near the security turnstiles. Nathan did not reach down to retrieve the piece. He monitored the scrolling data packets on his handheld device, watching the temporary isolation barriers he had established at midnight successfully redirect Vanguard's remaining liquidity into a protected receivership queue. The system was performing exactly as he had engineered it during his tenure at the regional clearinghouse. He heard the sudden hiss of the pneumatic elevator, brakes engaging behind the main column. The doors parted to reveal the group of senior directors, their polished leather shoes clicking loudly as they scattered across the lobby in a disorganized circle. Julian Thorne rushed toward the main exit with his briefcase half open, his eyes scanning the driveway for the legal team's courier. He ran straight past the corner bench, his coat brushing against Nathan's denim sleeve for the second time that afternoon. Nathan looked up, his expression perfectly stoic under the cold morning shadows. Victoria Sterling did not move her fingers from the edge of the reception desk, her body freezing as the weight of the stenciled pages registered against her palms. The silence in the atrium widened until the low, constant hum of the ceiling ventilation system became the loudest sound in the open space. Julian Thorne stepped backward from the console, his leather briefcase slipping slightly through his hand until the corner metal bracket scraped against the granite floor. He stared at the blue characters changing on Nathan Vance's handheld device, his eyes tracking the synchronization sequence that matched the corporate treasury terminal precisely. The operational shield had collapsed. Julian reached into his breast pocket, drew out his phone, and dialed the extension for the secondary clearing office in Nevada 3 times without receiving a single tone. The line was entirely dead. The legal director placed his glasses back into his pocket and took a single certified copy of the blind trust disclosure from his document case. He stepped past Julian, stopping exactly 2 feet from Nathan before lowering his shoulders by an inch. The filing was time-stamped at 11:45 last night, Miss Sterling, the attorney said, his voice level as he held the paperwork flat between his hands. The convertible debt interest carries a supermajority governance override that activates automatically upon a technical equity breach. Victoria took the verification binder, her fingers tracing the black seal thumbtacked to the primary page. She did not look at the middle managers, who were beginning to stand near the perimeter glass of the second-floor mezzanine. Her grandfather had always operated Vanguard on the assumption that visible capital was the only metric that altered a negotiation table. She looked down at the frayed hem of Nathan's denim cuff, then at the hard-coded validation token showing the final authorization string. The $40 million in liquidity had never belonged to the regional banking syndicate. She looked at Julian, who was attempting to rebuild his composure by straightening the lapels of his suit coat. This position requires an independent board assessment before any structural changes clear the compliance queue, Julian said, his voice lifting slightly as he turned back toward the main turnstiles. An external consultant in a work jacket does not possess the unilateral authority to modify a municipal credit facility. Nathan Vance did not look up from Toby's toy truck. He took the $20 bill Julian had thrown onto his knee earlier, slid it flat across the marble surface toward the chief operating officer, and adjusted the wool scarf around his son's collar. Toby watched the paper currency slide over the stone until it rested against the leather edge of Julian's boot. Close-up details on the child's face showed a quiet poise borrowed from his father. The sub-fiduciary debt was consolidated under Apex Trust 14 months ago, Julian, Nathan said, his voice flat and entirely devoid of heat. The compliance boards have already logged the notarized signatures from the primary beneficiaries. The elevator doors behind the center column hummed open once more, their white indicator lights casting a steady shadow across the floor. Julian Thorne took a single step toward the center console, his hand reaching out to grab the edge of the mahogany counter to steady himself. His fingers left a smear of moisture on the dark, polished wood. The white lights from the elevator enclosure remained fixed, casting long, unmoving shadows past Victoria Sterling's boots toward the turnstiles. The building was completely quiet now. The low hum of the climate control systems seemed to drop an octave as the floor staff stood behind their terminals without moving. Julian looked down at the $20 bill resting against his leather boot, then back at Nathan Vance's faded denim jacket. His jaw shifted tightly as he attempted to draw a breath through the heavy, stagnant lobby air. The general counsel did not hand the registry binding back to Victoria. He turned to the 3rd page of the filing, his thumb pressing against a line of small, notarized text with enough force to crease the paper. The restructuring execution was verified by the Board of Trustees at 11:45, the lawyer said, his voice dropping into a dry, precise tone that left no room for inference. The preferred stock provisions grant the primary beneficiary immediate authority to declare an administrative vacancy if the debt ratios are compromised. Victoria did not pull the binder away from him. She failed to change her posture or look up at the 3rd-floor partitions where the technical staff continued to monitor the screen metrics. Her grandfather had spent 30 years building the logistics network on the assumption that a small-town consultant could never accumulate enough institutional leverage to threaten the executive floor. She looked at Toby, who was carefully wiping a trace of gray dust off the wooden hood of his toy truck with the hem of his thinned wool scarf. The little boy did not look up at the suits or acknowledge the red lockout indicator still flashing on the main gate panel. Julian Thorne drew his shoulders back, his right hand moving into his coat pocket to look for his secondary vehicle keys. "This lobby is private property under a valid municipal lease agreement," Julian said, looking straight past Nathan toward the security station. "A regional clearing vehicle does not override the operating signatures of this board." Nathan Vance picked up the canvas folder from the counter, pulled the zipper closed with a single decisive motion, and slung the thinned thong over his shoulder. He did not change his posture or raise his voice to counter Julian's tone. "The municipal lease was executed through a Vanguard subsidiary that dissolved at midnight, Julian," Nathan said, his voice level and entirely dry. "The assets returned to the primary trust when your bridge loan application failed the compliance sweep." The legal director stepped backward until his heels met the base of the elevator pillar, his hands folding over the document case without another word. The silence in the atrium remained unbroken as Nathan Vance took Toby's small hand back into his own and turned toward the glass doors. Julian Thorne's hand remained frozen near his upper coat pocket, the sharp texture of the $20 bill edge pressing into his chest as he stared at the revolving exit glass doors. The automated lobby gates behind him clicked open completely, allowing a rush of winter wind to sweep across the marble tiles. Victoria Sterling took 3 steps away from the reception counter, her leather boots making an irregular sound before her knees buckled by an inch. She reached out to steady herself against the brass guide rail of the escalator bay, her gaze dropping to the floor pan. The security team didn't look at Julian or wait for a verbal directive from Victoria. The head guard stepped forward, tapped the encrypted mobile display terminal, and placed his company access badge face down on the granite surface. "The internal server credentials have been revoked by the regulatory desk in New York," the guard said, his voice entirely flat as he pulled the master keys from his utility belt. The administrative lockout took effect at 12 minutes past the hour. Julian Thorne pulled his fingers away from his blazer pocket, his body rigid while he turned to face the executive director who had just surfaced from the lower parking concourse. The general counsel did not read from the corporate charter. He handed a printed copy of the supermajority equity decree directly to Nathan Vance, his pen resting across the signature line without a single trace of hesitation. Nathan did not glance at Victoria's signature on the old partnership riders. He adjusted Toby's thinned wool scarf, lifted the child into the crook of his denim sleeve, and slid the hard-coded token back into his denim jacket pocket. The 12-digit master authorization string had completed its final variable rotation. The $40 million in bridge loans was officially frozen within the receivership queue. Victoria looked at Julian's boot, where the broken wooden toy wheel remained pressed against the leather seam. "This transition requires a formal notification period under Clause 14 of the State Logistics Framework," Victoria said, her voice dropping into a dry cadence that did not carry beyond the counter unit. "An external fiduciary cannot execute a board vacancy without a certified compliance sweep." Nathan Vance took the manila envelope from the counter space, handed the wrapped canvas bundle to the lawyer, and walked toward the glass exit doors without breaking his stride. He did not raise his voice or look up at the third-floor partitions where the staff continued to watch the lobby floor. The compliance sweep concluded when Julian processed the off-book transaction receipts at midnight, Victoria, Nathan said, his hand pushing the heavy metal exit bracket down with a single decisive motion. The board options were terminated when the primary credit facility collapsed. The legal director stepped away from the escalator step, his fingers folding over his briefcase as the flock of vice presidents scattered toward the side turnstiles. The heavy pneumatic seals on the main perimeter gates clicked locked behind them. The cold morning draft outside the revolving glass doors gave way to the quiet baseline of the open street, where the traffic along the boulevard moved with a steady, unhurried precision. Nathan Vance settled Toby into the passenger seat of his 10-year-old vehicle, adjusting the thinned wool scarf around the boy's neck before closing the door with a single decisive click. The broken toy truck remained flat on the dashboard organizer, its single remaining wheel reflecting the gray winter light. Victoria Sterling stood near the heavy glass threshold of the tower, her coat thudding against the frame structure as she watched the car line merge into the main lane. The legal director walked past her toward the waiting town car, his leather document case secured beneath his arm without any additional notation sheets. Vanguard Apex had officially entered a comprehensive internal audit cycle. Victoria reached out her fingers, touched the cold brass handle of the entry rail, and turned back to face the empty atrium counter. Her father had spent 40 years running the regional clearing matrix on the theory that power belonged exclusively to the people who spoke loudest in the corporate suites. She looked down at her polished leather boots, noticing the tiny grain of gray dust that Toby had brushed off his toy during the absolute lockout window. The 30 minutes she had forced them to wait on the bench had not preserved her balance sheet. She turned to the general counsel, who was already coordinating the emergency transition board over his earpiece. "Cancel the remaining appointments for the operations review," Victoria said, her voice dropping into a clean, flat register that left no room for secondary arguments. "We need to clear the compliance queue before the federal representatives arrive tomorrow morning." Nathan Vance checked his handheld terminal as the vehicle cleared the interstate interchange, the screen indicating that the $40 million in emergency liquidity had settled firmly within the protected receivership accounts. He reached over, rubbed his son's cold shoulder with a gentle palm, and guided the car toward the small diner near the 3rd Street exit. Toby sat upright against the seat cushion, his small thumb tracking the loose wooden truck wheel he had kept in his pocket throughout the transaction process. The little boy did not ask about the $20 bill or mention the executives who had scattered near the turnstiles. "Dad," Toby said, looking straight through the clear glass of the passenger window at the passing city buildings. The men in the big office forgot to check if the bridge was safe before they ordered everyone to cross it. Nathan slowed the engine as they entered the restaurant lot, his fingers resting level on the steering mechanism. "They were looking at the map instead of the river, Toby," Nathan said, his tone dry and completely devoid of drama. "Sometimes people stay in high rooms so long they forget how heavy the ground is." Victoria Sterling closed her personal laptop flat on her desk 2 hours later, her face completely composed under the low office shadows as she drafted the formal notification letter to Apex Trust. The structural parameters had changed permanently. She had paid an expensive price to learn that an organization cannot survive its own blindness, and she did not intend to hide the data from the next board configuration. She stood up, walked to the tall panoramic window overlooking the lobby floor below, and signed the operational guidelines for the frontline clearing engineers. The story settled into the quiet afternoon brightness of Marlowe Street, where 2 adults stood close enough to read the true value of an unwrinkled garment, and a child held a wooden truck that could finally be repaired properly.